Okay, guys, so we're looking at the Cold War in Asia, and so I think it's important for us to take a deeper dive into a figure that's going to dominate China for much of the 20th century, and that is a fellow named Mao Zedong, who was born in 1893 to a prosperous farmer. He is not part of the elite class, he is part of the peasant class, but again, notice, not poor, because the poor, you can always find an exception to the rule, but the poor do not really run revolutions. They're just normally tools of revolution. He is going to be somewhat educated, and he will develop a lifelong obsession with George Washington that he will use later on when he interacts with Americans. But it was a sincere like of Washington because he understood the need for founding fathers. He also likes Napoleon a bit, and it's for the same reason. He saw Napoleon as remaking France. But anyway, he rewrote once, quote, "We need great people like these. We ought to study them and find out how we can make China rich and strong and so avoid becoming like Annam, Korea, and India." After 6 years of hard fighting, Washington defeated the British and began to build up America, end quote. So there's that. He likes Washington. He does not like absolute monarchy in the China of his youth, so he gets engaged in lots of revolutionary movements. The Comintern, after the Russian Revolution, is going to plant communism in China, and it's not long until Mao is a part of the Communist Party. He's going to fight in the Chinese Civil War against Chiang Kai-shek, who was a nationalist. The Civil War breaks out in 1927, but he doesn't become a familiar name to Americans until the journalist Edgar Snow interviews him in the 1930s, around 1936 time frame. So Snow's coverage of Mao is going to be pretty favorable, and this is in part because he will make changes to his reporting at the request of Mao and another famous communist called Zhou Enlai. And Snow's been criticized for that, for glossing over some communist actions that are rather totalitarian, especially during World War II. And he said about this, quote, "In this international cataclysm brought on by fascists, it is no more possible for any people to remain neutral than it is for a man surrounded by bubonic plague to remain neutral toward the rat population. Whether you like it or not, your life as a force is bound either to help the rats or to hinder them. Nobody can be immunized against the germs of history," end quote. And you know what? Okay, Edgar Snow, we were actually allied with Joseph Stalin during World War II because Hitler was a horrible evil in the world and we needed to defeat him. Even though Stalin was a horrible evil in the world and later on we really wish we could defeat him. But the thing that Edgar Snow is saying there is history, life, the world, interact, all of this is complicated. And you can't just white hat, black hat it all the time. It just doesn't work that way. Life is not that simple. And okay, Snow, okay, I feel you. So after World War II, Mao is clearly the leader of the communists, with whom Truman's Secretary of State, George Marshall, will actually mediate to try and stop China from devolving back into a civil war. But the U.S. is going to take up with Chiang Kai-shek because he was our ally during World War II as a nationalist, and we don't like communists. And so Mao will begin to frame the United States is an imperialist nation. And of course, he will win the Civil War against Chiang Kai-shek, so he will be in a position of power. And he will not recognize any American treaties in China that were negotiated with the nationalists, who we actually favor over him. He ejects foreign institutions from China. He seeks to either neutralize or control American journalists. Edgar Snow is still writing some stuff about him. Mao will say in the report on the second session of 7th Central Committee that his government was intent on, quote, "wiping out the control of the imperialists in China completely with planned steps," end quote. So Mao will deliberately craft a vision of Americans as part of a reactionary imperialist force intent on sabotaging the communists in China through, how does he do that? He has these giant polemics and he uses propaganda, and all of that is aimed at the peasant class. So per interactions between China and the US during the Korean War, Mao is going to come to think that the US is less powerful than he had thought it was during World War II. And through various interactions in the 1950s, he begins to believe the policies of the US during the Cold War were mostly defensive rather than offensive. And by the way, that means that Mao thinks that we're weak. He thinks reactionaries are weak. But he still has to respect us because we were actually the superpower. And he turns inward to kind of take care of some business at home. And so in the 50s, there was something called the 100 Flowers Movement. It was launched in 1956. And Mao goes around and he says to intellectuals, hey guys, I want to hear what your thoughts are. I want to hear what we're doing. I want to know if I'm doing things right. I want you, everyone, let's have a big debate, right? Express your ideas and it will be like 100 different flowers blooming because this diversity of thought is good. Well, actually, what Mao wanted to do was to see those flowers and pluck the ones he didn't like. So the people who say things that aren't right, he goes, he plucks, he throws them into slave labor camps, which is great because it's good timing because he's about to start his great leap forward, which is a hootenanny of a good time. So communism is part of a controlled economy, and Mao will collectivize all agriculture and he will direct how all of that's supposed to run. And the big result is that perhaps 45 million people starve to death, which makes people unhappy. So Mao's reaction to that is going to be the Cultural Revolution, to show that his decisions have always been good and that some people just didn't understand what he was saying. They weren't doing communism right. And they are trying to sabotage, like they're capitalist, revisionist in our midst, and they're trying to sabotage everything. And the rural cadres were simply confused. So since bad party leaders had led the people astray, they needed to be eradicated. Something called, quote, living ideological indoctrination, end quote, was necessary as a corrective. So a debate was again encouraged so we can have some blooming flowers, though people are smart enough, a lot of them, to write under pseudonyms at this point. And ideas at the beginning of this, which is like late 1959, 1960, 61, you can say what you want to say, even though ideas insulting Mao are never looked upon favorably, but you can say what you want to say, and an idea that was considered just normal, like mainstream, like it was a thought, it was based on your culture or whatever, one day was fine, like in 1961, and then all of a sudden time goes by a little bit, and that thought, boom, bad, suddenly dissident. You're a weed in the mist. So according to Mao, once he again identifies what's happening in his garden, the goal of the Cultural Revolution is going to be educating men anew and reorganizing revolutionary ranks. So art, literature, novels, all of that kind of stuff, he sees that as having different points of view that can be subversive to his government. So it all needs to be brought under one umbrella, and it needs to be all of a sudden not full of harmful bourgeoisie influences or unhealthy ideas, but full of the good ideas, the right thinking. And so the youth have to be educated properly, and they don't have as many prospects after this giant leap forward. So they need to understand that what they're doing is it's something good and right and just, and we just need to educate them. And if we need to use some violent coercion, that's fine. So some of the weeds are going to start being plucked in the early 60s from the Communist Garden, and some of these guys are allies of Mao, people who are really high up in the communist power construct, people like Ping Chen, who was originally in charge of the Purge of the Arts. So, and I can't say I feel bad for him, but in 1964, Mao will dismiss Western theories that deal with individual rights and freedom as not useful because they aren't for him. And by 1965, loyalty is judged by one's attitude towards Mao himself, as old ideas are destroyed despite traditions sometimes being obstinate, so you got to work hard to destroy it. Some individuals are defended for a while, but intellectual orthodoxy or correct thinking is ultimately going to be demanded because you just can't have certain ideas. They're just bad. Everyone knows. Professors, writers, scholars, editors, they're all going to be targets. And even military leaders begin to disappear. So this is all presented, by the way, don't worry if this sounds like kind of bad, it's all justice. It's just social justice, guys. I mean, we're just remaking the people. Yeah, no, we need to tear down the old because it's full of bad stuff, and we need to brand new good stuff. Good, just society. That's what we're getting here. So a party editorial written at the beginning of this Cultural Revolution, which is in the mid-1960s, said, quote, "Without destruction, there will be no construction. We are described as men of dynamite and clubs. That's right. We shall smash anyone who tries to oppose the party and socialism." Another said, quote, "Like the red rising sun in the east, the unprecedented great proletarian cultural revolution is illuminating the land with its brilliant rays," end quote. That sounds nice. A party directive said, quote, "Our objective is to struggle against and crush those persons in authority who are taking the capitalist road," because that's a bad road, end quote. Weeks of terror were ignited in August of 1966 by bands of interesting teenagers who joined something called the Red Guard, who direct violence at anyone with whom they disagree or who would not submit to self-criticism. Like, y'all, if you don't just examine yourself and understand that you are part of the problem and it's really you who created everything that's wrong in China, then you might need to be beaten up or maybe even killed in the streets. If you have a bougie haircut, that's bad. I wouldn't go out at night. Dissident professors are going to be forced to kneel in classrooms in front of their students so their students can spit on them, because they have bad thinking. Mao is going to lead rallies to encourage protest of this sort in China, and he's going to stop his actual security forces from stopping the Red Guard from doing any of this. Turmoil and disorder are his tool. Okay, but we're just destroying individuality for the collective good, right? So the Red Guard will then destroy historic artifacts and monuments and pull that stuff down because it's all based on bad thinking, bad history, bad, and we're in the right think now. So, we need to remake Old China because Old China is not good. Strangely, pet cats, by the way, in 1966 are going to be littering the streets with their little paws tied together because pet cats are a sign of oppression because, the bourgeois, they own cats. It doesn't make any sense, but whatever. They burned the British embassy while chanting, "Kill, kill." Why? Because they were imperialists, those Brits. They deserved it. Everyone is discarding the old, and so they need a new. Mao creates his little red book that's been floating around, and he circulates it to the population, and you're forced to read it in public, and if you don't have it, and if you can't recite from it, you might be killed or beaten at least. For those of you who are fascinated with violence as a tool, by the way, Mao said this in his book that you might embrace. Quote, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun," end quote. Which he should know because he's going to then unleash a whole bunch of violence from his forces, the military, not just the Red Guard, onto his people. Again, you could be beaten or killed if you weren't engaged in right thinking, whatever the heck that was. So, can you buy the Little Red Book in the United States? Yes. Yes, you can. You can go to Amazon. You can buy it now because we're a free people, and free people are able to do things like engage with other people's ideas, even if they're psycho. But if you do that, I hope that you understand where Mao's ideas lead as the Cultural Revolution was ongoing until he dies. The old was discarded, history was destroyed, millions were dead, but there was a lot of re-education to get the right thinking in China. So back then, Mao is going to use propaganda to control his people. The United States is going to be a good foil because we are replete with examples of ills that exist within a capitalist state. And he will say, you don't want to live over there, right? You've got this glorious utopia because the United States, bad country. Sadly, some people really think that. I don't get it, but all right. We do have our problems, but y'all. Today, Xi Jinping, who's a brutal dictator in his own right, he was a young teenager. I think he was around 13 when the Cultural Revolution was really going. He will also use the United States as a foil for his own purposes. And the unrest in American society is great for him. He has all kinds of news agencies that show our unrest in the street, and he tries to hide, manipulate, and distort information from here for there because everything is very controlled there. Or maybe he's just reporting the news here. I don't know. Either way, Mao did not understand the United States well. He did not understand our obsession with individual rights and freedom, even though he did admire some of our figures as revolutionaries. And he wasn't the greatest of guys. But you need to know who Mao was, and that his Cultural Revolution will literally kill millions more people after his Great Leap Forward, which killed millions and millions. But, you know, viva la revolution.